If you've ever noticed that you don't really feel the need to compete with anyone, not at work, not with friends, not even in small, everyday situations, it might seem like just a personality quirk. But people who move through the world this way often have a much more layered psychology than they realize. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. You just quietly do your thing without trying to beat anyone. You're not threatened when someone else succeeds. And in many cases, you genuinely don't care about being first. But that calm exterior says more about your inner world than most people would assume. Because being non-competitive isn't the absence of something. It's usually the presence of something deeper. People who don't feel competitive often grew up learning a subtle rule, that comparison wasn't safe for them. Sometimes they were the kid who felt overshadowed, so competing never felt like a winnable game. Other times, they watched competition create tension or conflict in their family, so they learned to stay out of anything that might trigger the same energy. And in many cases, they simply found comfort in focusing inward instead of outward. Progress became something personal, not something to display. So the behavior looks simple, not caring about being the best, but the hidden meaning is usually a quiet desire to protect their emotional space. That lack of competitiveness isn't laziness or passivity or fear. It's a form of control. A way of saying, I get to define what matters to me, not other people. A lot of people who don't feel competitive have a very specific micro-behavior. When someone else shares an accomplishment, they don't feel the need to match it. No one-upsmanship, no hidden jealousy, just a genuine, that's great for you. But underneath that calm reaction is something interesting. They've built an identity around internal standards instead of external ones. They don't measure their worth by outperforming others, but by staying aligned with who they believe they are. And that creates a different relationship with achievement. It becomes something quiet, self-contained, almost sacred. They don't rush, they don't compare timelines, they don't chase validation. Not because they don't want more from life, but because they don't want their identity to be shaped by competition. For them, standing alone feels safer than standing above. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people assume a non-competitive person must be extremely confident or extremely insecure, but the truth is usually neither. It's about emotional safety. Competition requires exposing your desires. It requires showing what you want, what matters to you, and where you hope to win. And for some people, that level of vulnerability feels uncomfortable. So staying non-competitive becomes a way to stay in control of their inner world. If you don't enter the race, no one can judge how fast you ran. No one can question your worth. No one gets access to the pressure points inside you. It's not avoidance, it's protection, a way of preserving a sense of peace that they had to build themselves. Another subtle pattern appears in conversations. Non-competitive people rarely enter debates just to prove a point, not because they can't win, but because they don't find winning emotionally rewarding. Growing up, they might have learned that harmony mattered more than being right, or they realized that arguing drains them more than silence does, or maybe they simply value understanding over dominance. So they let others have the last word. They allow space. They choose calm over victory. And people misinterpret this as indifference, but it's not apathy, it's self-preservation. Conflict pulls them out of themselves, and they have spent years building a life that feels steady, stable, quietly their own. But the real meaning sits at an even deeper level. Non-competitive people often carry a strong, almost unshakable internal compass. They don't need a scoreboard to tell them how they're doing. Their validation comes from alignment, not achievement, and that changes everything. It makes them less reactive, less threatened, less concerned with being perceived as better. In a world built on comparison, they choose self-direction. In a culture obsessed with winning, they choose inner coherence. That doesn't make them weak, it makes them anchored. They're not running the same race as everyone else because they already decided what race they're in. Once you notice this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. The quiet calm, the lack of urgency, the comfort with someone else being in the spotlight, the internal focus that never fully reveals itself. It was never about not caring. It was never about fear. It was never random. It was a psychological pattern shaped over years, a way of navigating the world without letting the world define them. And once you understand it, you start to see how much depth exists underneath the surface of a person who simply doesn't feel the pull to compete. If this explains something for you, there's always more to uncover. Understanding yourself is the beginning of everything.